The silence in Archive Hall 7 was a manufactured thing, a sound sculpted from the absence of life. It was not the quiet of a library, which hummed with the ghosts of turning pages and whispered thoughts, nor the peace of a forest at dusk. It was a sterile, pressurized void, punctuated only by the rhythmic, sub-audible thrum of the climate control systems and the whisper-faint slide of Elian's slippers on the polished composite floor. He was a ghost here, too, of a sort, a living record, catalogued and controlled. 0734. That was his designation, a string of numbers and a letter that defined the precise, narrow parameters of his existence. He moved between towering shelves of data crystals, his hands, sheathed in thin, static-free gloves, performing their tasks with an economy of motion that had been drilled into him since the creche. Retrieve, scan, file, repeat. The air, recycled and filtered to a state of absolute neutrality, carried no scent. It was the first and most fundamental rule of the Meridian Concordance: control the senses, control the self. For an Omega, this was not merely a rule, it was salvation. He had been taught this truth until it was a part of his cellular memory. Your nature is a sickness, your scent, a contagion, your instincts, a weakness to be purged. The daily regimen of suppressants ensured this. A small nutrient-neutral paste ingested at 0600, a transdermal patch applied at 1800. They kept his biology dormant, his mind clear, his presence unobtrusive. They made him a functional asset. He was not an asset today. Today, something was wrong, a tremor deep in his bones, a low-frequency hum that had nothing to do with the facility's machinery. It started when the announcement had rippled through their internal comms, a calm, synthesized voice informing all personnel of the arrival of the new sector security director. The name was unfamiliar. Kalen. The title meant little. Alphas were a distant concept, figures of authority seen only in sanctioned media streams, their power and presence discussed in the same abstract cautionary tones as natural disasters or viral outbreaks. They were forces of chaos, the antithesis of the Concordance's placid order. None had ever set foot in Archive Hall 7. The Alphas, who managed the upper echelons of the Concordance, were a different breed, polished, scent-blocked, as sterile in their presentation as the facilities they commanded. This one, the announcement implied, was different. He was from the outer sectors. The name alone was a discordant note in the sterile symphony of Elian's life. The outer sectors were a place of myth and fear, a chaotic fringe where the Concordance's control was said to be frayed, where biology was not so neatly contained, a place where things ran wild. Elian paused, his hand hovering over a glowing data crystal. The tremor intensified. He pressed his gloved palm against his sternum, a reflexive gesture to quiet the strange fluttering in his chest. It felt like a circuit misfiring, a ghost in his own machine. He attributed it to a subtle fluctuation in his dosage. It happened sometimes. The dispensary's calibration could drift by a microgram, and the result was a day of vague anxiety, a phantom itch under the skin. He would report it in his evening wellness log. An adjustment would be made. The system would correct itself. The system always corrected itself. He slid the crystal into its slot. It clicked into place with a sound so faint it was more a feeling than a noise. He turned, and the world tilted on its axis. He was standing at the end of the aisle. The new director, Kalen. The sterile, scentless air was suddenly thick, heavy, charged with something Elian had no name for. It was an invasive presence, a pressure change that made his ears ache. He was tall, broader than the sanitized figures in the media streams, his uniform a darker grey than the standard concordance issue, its cut severe and functional. But it was not his size or his unfamiliar uniform that held Elian paralyzed. It was the air around him. It had a scent. The realization was so profound, so alien, that Elian's mind struggled to process it. It was like a blind man seeing color for the first time, a sensory input so overwhelming it bypassed cognition and struck directly at some primal, dormant part of his brain. The scent was clean but wild, like the air after a lightning strike, sharp with ozone and the cold, hard smell of wet stone. It was not unpleasant. It was terrifying. It was the scent of an alpha, unfiltered, uncontrolled, a violation of every protocol, every lesson, every chemical barrier that had defined his world. Elian's training took over. Avert the gaze. Minimize presence. Do not engage. He lowered his head, his eyes fixed on the seamless grey floor, and tried to regulate his breathing. But the scent was already inside him, a foreign substance in his bloodstream. It was pulling at threads he didn't know he possessed, awakening nerves that had slept for a lifetime. He could feel his own placid biochemistry beginning to churn, a slow, ugly rebellion in the quiet of his cells. The suppressants were a dam, and this scent was the first hairline crack. He felt the alpha's gaze on him, a palpable weight. The silence stretched, no longer empty, but filled with a deafening, unspoken tension. The hum of the facility seemed to fade into nothingness, leaving only the frantic, silent scream of Elian's own nervous system. He could not stay here. He had to move, to retreat to the sterile safety of his designated workstation, to the familiar rhythm of his duties. He took a hesitant step, a puppet with a tangled string. The man spoke. His voice was low, a gravelly timbre that seemed to vibrate in the dense air. 0734. Elian flinched. He had never heard his designation spoken with such a voice. The synthesized announcements were smooth, impersonal. The tones of Director Valerius, the facility's beta administrator, were clipped and dry. This voice was different. It was rough, textured, real. It made his designation sound less like a label and more like a name being spoken for the first time. He stopped, his body rigid. Protocol dictated he acknowledged the summons. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his gaze still welded to the floor. The alpha took a step closer. The scent intensified, a wave of ozone and cold rock that washed over Elian, making the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Look at me. It was not a request. The command bypassed his conscious thought, and his head lifted of its own accord. He met the alpha's eyes. They were the color of slate, dark and unreadable, set in a face that was all sharp angles and hard planes. There was a faint, silvery scar that cut through his left eyebrow, a tiny flaw in an otherwise imposing, symmetrical face. He was not smiling, but there was no overt hostility in his expression either. There was only a calm, unnerving intensity, a focused stillness that was more intimidating than any overt display of aggression. He was observing Elian not as a person or even an asset, but as a complex piece of machinery he was trying to understand, or perhaps as a puzzle he intended to solve. Elian felt a tremor run through him, a violent shudder he could not suppress. It was his body's reaction to a primary stimulus it had been conditioned to never experience. Alpha, danger, chaos, run. But he was trapped, pinned by that slate-gray gaze, by the sheer overwhelming reality of this man's presence. The carefully constructed walls of his world, the sterile silence and the chemical peace were crumbling. And in their place, something ancient and terrified was beginning to wake up. The Alpha, Kalen, held his gaze for a long, unbearable moment before a flicker of something, not pity, but perhaps clinical assessment, crossed his features. He gave a curt nod, a dismissal that felt more like a temporary reprieve than an end to the encounter. "As you were," he said, his voice just as low and resonant as before. He turned and walked away, his heavy boots making no sound on the vibration-dampening floor. The oppressive weight of his presence receded with him, but the scent lingered, a ghost of ozone and stone clinging to the neutral air, a stain on the perfect, sterile environment. Elian stood frozen for a full minute after he was gone, his gloved hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. His internal systems were in revolt. A cold sweat prickled at his temples, and his breath came in shallow, ragged bursts. The dam of his suppressants was holding, but he could feel the pressure building against it, the insistent, terrifying push of his own biology. He finally forced his limbs to move, turning back to his duties with a jerky, unnatural stiffness. Retrieve, scan, file. The motions were the same, but the context had been irrevocably altered. The silence of the archive no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. The neutral air was no longer a comfort. It was a lie, a thin veil that could be torn apart by a single, unfiltered breath. He spent the rest of the day in a state of heightened, agonizing awareness. Every subtle shift in the air pressure, every distant, unidentifiable sound sent a jolt of panic through him. He felt exposed, his meticulously controlled world rendered fragile and transparent. The ghost of the Alpha's scent followed him, a phantom trace that his mind kept conjuring, making him flinch at shadows. When his shift ended at 1800, he practically fled to the sterile confines of his assigned habitation pod. The small, white, featureless room was usually a sanctuary, a place where the last vestiges of the day's sensory input were scrubbed away. Tonight, it felt like a cage. He stripped off his uniform, his movements hurried and clumsy. As he removed the day's transdermal patch from his arm, he noticed his hand was trembling. He prepared for the evening ritual, the nutrient paste, the sonic cleanser, the application of the new patch. But as he held the small foil-wrapped square in his hand, a wave of revulsion washed over him. This small piece of polymer and chemicals was the architect of his peace, the jailer of his nature. For the first time in his life, he hesitated. What would happen if he just didn't? The thought was heretical, a product of the day's contamination. It was a dangerous, insane impulse. Without the suppressants, the sickness would take hold. The fever, the irrationality, the humiliating, animalistic needs he'd only read about in cautionary texts. He would become unstable. He would be decommissioned. With a shaking hand, he peeled the backing from the patch and pressed it firmly onto the clean skin of his shoulder. He had to. It was survival. But as the cool, clinical tingle of the medication began to seep into his system, it did not bring the usual sense of calm. Instead, it felt like a betrayal. He lay on his sleep pallet, staring up at the blank white ceiling, and listened to the frantic beating of his own heart. The encounter in the archive replayed in his mind, a continuous, looping nightmare. The Alpha's eyes, the scar, the scent, that scent. It had bypassed the chemical locks on his senses and plugged directly into some ancient, hardwired part of his brain. It had spoken a language his body understood, even if his mind did not. It had said Alpha, and his body, despite a lifetime of conditioning and chemical persuasion, had whispered back, Omega. The next few days were a quiet torment. Kalen became a fixture in the archives. He would appear without warning, a silent, imposing figure standing at the end of an aisle, his presence a constant, low-grade threat. He rarely spoke to Elian directly, but Elian could always feel his eyes on him. He was being studied. The purpose of this scrutiny was a terrifying mystery. Was he being evaluated for some flaw? Had the Alpha detected the subtle crack in his conditioning? Was decommissioning imminent? The fear was a constant, metallic taste in his mouth. But fear was not the only thing. Alongside the terror, something else was growing, a strange, perverse curiosity. He found himself cataloguing the details of the Alpha's presence, the way he moved with a predator's economy, a stark contrast to the subdued, gliding motions of the betas and other omegas, the way his gaze seemed to miss nothing, sweeping over the data stacks with an unnerving perception. And always, the scent. It seemed to be a deliberate act of defiance. In a world where such things were scrubbed, hidden, and medicated into non-existence, Kalen wore his alpha nature like a mantle, an undeniable fact that warped the reality around him. Sometimes the scent would be stronger, carrying new notes, the faint, sharp smell of ozone after a security grid diagnostic, or a warmer, almost earthy undertone when he returned from the upper levels. Elian began to learn its nuances, an involuntary, secret study. His body was learning too. The suppressants were still working, holding the line, but he could feel the strain. He started experiencing phantom sensations, a fleeting warmth in his belly, a sudden inexplicable ache in his lower back. His sense of smell, long dulled to near non-existence, began to sharpen in tiny, alarming increments. He could suddenly detect the faint, dry scent of the aging polymers in the data crystals, the sterile tang of the cleaning solvents used by the maintenance drones, the almost imperceptible difference in the recycled air between one corridor and the next. The world was slowly, painfully coming into focus, and it was overwhelming. One afternoon, while working in a little-used sub-level of the archives, the tremors started again, stronger this time. A wave of heat washed over him, so intense it made him dizzy. His skin felt too tight, his nerves raw and exposed. He stumbled, catching himself against a shelf of obsolete memory drives. His breath hitched, and a low, involuntary sound, a soft whimper, escaped his lips. He clapped a hand over his mouth, his eyes wide with horror. That sound. It was the sound of an animal. It was the sound of everything he had been taught to fear and despise in himself. He sank to the floor, curling into a tight ball, trying to make himself smaller, to disappear. The heat intensified, coiling in his gut. It was a micro-heat. He'd read the clinical descriptions, a biological misfire, a symptom of dosage failure or extreme environmental stress. It was a precursor to the full, devastating fever of a true heat, a state of being so debased it was spoken of only in whispers. He had to get it under control. He had to get back to his pod, to an emergency dose of stabilizers. He pushed himself to his feet, his legs shaking. The world swam before his eyes. He had to get out of the archives without being seen. He staggered toward the exit, his body screaming in protest. As he rounded the corner into the main corridor, a figure blocked his path. Kalen. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed over his chest, as if he had been waiting. The sight of him sent a fresh wave of panic and heat through Elian's system. Of all the people to see him like this. "You're unwell," Kalen stated. It was not a question. His slate-grey eyes scanned Elian from head to toe, his expression unreadable but intense. Elian couldn't speak. His throat was tight, his mind a maelstrom of fear and shame. He just shook his head, a pathetic, jerky motion. He tried to sidle past, to escape into the anonymous safety of the transit system. Kalen moved, not with aggression, but with a fluid, deliberate motion that put him directly in Elian's way. He was a wall of dark grey fabric and solid muscle, a mountain of ozone and stone. "Don't run." The words were spoken softly, almost a murmur, but they landed with the force of a physical blow. They were the two most illogical words in the universe. Everything in Elian, his conditioning, his instincts, his terror, was screaming at him to run, to flee from this alpha, this catalyst of his body's horrifying rebellion. But the quiet authority in that voice, the sheer, immovable presence of the man before him, rooted him to the spot. He looked up, his vision blurred with unshed tears of panic, and met the alpha's gaze. In that moment, the carefully constructed dam inside him didn't just crack. It shattered. A scent, his own scent, bloomed in the air around him, faint and shaky, but undeniable. It was a scent he had never known, something he had no words for. It smelled of dry earth after a long-awaited rain, and something else, something fragile and sweet, like a flower that only dared to open in the dead of night. It was the smell of his own fear, his own shame, and his own long-buried nature, finally breaking free. Kalen's expression shifted, the clinical observation hardening into something sharper, more focused. His nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. He recognized the scent, not the specific notes, but the type. A distressed omega, unsanctioned, unshielded. In the sterile heart of a meridian concordance facility, it was the equivalent of a lit fuse in a munitions depot. Protocol demanded he sedate and quarantine the subject immediately. It demanded a full report to Director Valerius. It demanded a system-wide recalibration of suppressants for the entire Omega cohort. But Kalen did not move to his comms unit. He did not reach for the standard-issue tranquilizer dart in his belt. He remained perfectly still, a sentinel in the quiet corridor, his gaze locked on Elian's terrified, tear-streaked face. The scent of rain and night-blooming jasmine grew stronger, weaving itself into the air, a fragile, desperate tendril wrapping around the hard, clean edges of his own ozone and stone scent. It was a scent of pure, undiluted distress, and it resonated with a part of Kalen that the concordance had never been able to touch, a part he had shielded for years beneath layers of discipline and cold fury. He had smelled distress like this before, a long time ago, in another sterile white room, another life. The memory was a shard of glass in his gut. He pushed it down. Now was not the time. He had a mission, and this complication, this fragile, scent-blooming omega, was either a liability or an unforeseen opportunity. His decision would determine which. Elian, for his part, was drowning. The release of his own scent was the ultimate transgression. He was contaminating the facility. He was a biohazard. The shame was so profound it was a physical weight crushing the air from his lungs. He expected alarms. He expected the hiss of tranquilizer gas from ceiling vents. He expected to be dragged away by impassive beta orderlies, his designation logged on a report that would end with the word decommissioned. He did not expect the Alpha to simply stand there, watching him fall apart with that unnerving, analytical calm. "Breathe," Kalen commanded, his voice still low but with a new edge of steel in it. "Panicking will make it worse." It was absurd advice. Panic was the only rational response. But again, the command seemed to bypass his higher brain functions. Elian's body, desperately seeking an anchor in the storm of its own making, obeyed. He dragged in a shaky breath. It was a mistake. The air was now a heady, intoxicating mix of his own terrified scent and the Alpha's powerful, grounding presence. The combination was dizzying, overwhelming his already overloaded senses. His knees buckled. Kalen moved faster than Elian would have thought possible. In one fluid motion, he closed the distance between them, his arm shooting out to grip Elian's bicep, preventing him from collapsing. The contact was electric. Through the thin fabric of his uniform, Elian could feel the strength in that grip, the solid, living warmth of the man holding him. It was the first physical contact he'd had with another person in years that wasn't the impersonal, clinical touch of a medical technician. It was shocking. It was terrifying. And deep down, in a place he had never known existed, it was stabilizing. The heat in his body, which had been a wild, chaotic fire, seemed to coalesce, drawn toward that single point of contact. Kalen pulled him upright, his grip firm, but not bruising. He was so close now that Elian could feel the heat radiating from his body. The scent was a wall, a physical presence surrounding him. "Corridor 4 Gamma is a service conduit," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble so close to Elian's ear that it vibrated through his skull. "No sensor sweeps for another hour. We go there. Now." He didn't wait for an answer. He simply began to move, his hand still clamped firmly on Elian's arm, effectively dragging the trembling Omega along with him. Elian's feet stumbled, his mind a blank slate of shock and fear. He was being taken somewhere, by an Alpha, while in a state of biological failure. Every survival instinct he possessed screamed that this was the end. Yet his body, traitorously, followed. Kalen moved with a quiet urgency, his long strides eating up the distance. He navigated the labyrinthine corridors of the archive with a familiarity that was surprising for someone so new to the facility. He led Elian away from the main transit arteries into a series of older, less frequented sectors where the air filtration was a fraction less perfect, and the faint smell of aged electronics and dust hung in the air. He stopped before a featureless panel, almost identical to every other panel in the corridor. He pressed a sequence of points on its surface, and a section of the wall slid open with a near-silent hiss, revealing a dark, narrow space, a service conduit. Kalen pushed Elian gently but firmly inside, then followed, the panel sliding shut behind them, plunging them into near-total darkness. The space was cramped, filled with the hum of power conduits and the smell of ozone and warm metal. The only light was a faint red glow from a maintenance panel at the far end. Here, in the enclosed space, the combined scents were overpowering. Elian's jasmine and rain, Kalen's stone and lightning. They mingled in the dark, creating something new and complex and deeply, fundamentally alarming. Elian pressed himself against the cool metal wall, trying to put as much distance as possible between himself and the Alpha in the suffocating darkness. His micro-heat was peaking, the feverish warmth in his blood making him lightheaded. What are you doing?" he managed to whisper, his voice a reedy, pathetic thing. "Protocol requires you to report me." "Protocol is a flexible concept," Kalen replied from the darkness. His voice was calm, a stark contrast to the chaos raging inside Elian. "And Director Valerius has an overly rigid interpretation of it, reporting you would create a cascade of automated responses I'd rather avoid. It's inefficient." Inefficient. He was breaking a dozen cardinal rules of the concordance, risking his own high-ranking position for the sake of efficiency. The logic was so alien, so utterly at odds with the rigid, process-driven world Elian knew, that it momentarily stunned him out of his panic. Kalen shifted in the darkness. There was the faint rustle of fabric, the click of a latch. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, his voice softening fractionally, as if sensing Elian's terror. "But what is happening to you now? It's a system shock. Your body doesn't know how to process it. The concordance suppressants are designed for total erasure, not management. When they fail, the rebound is catastrophic." He took a step closer. Elian flinched, a full body tremor. "Stay back," he gasped. Kalen stopped. "I need to get closer. I have something that will help." "A sedative," Elian whispered, the word laced with despair. "You're going to sedate me and hand me over." "No," Kalen said, and the word was sharp, impatient. "If I wanted to sedate you, you'd already be unconscious. This is something else. A blocker patch from the outer sectors. It works differently. It won't erase what you're feeling. It will help you control it. It will mask the scent." The offer was impossible to believe. A piece of contraband technology. A solution that wasn't punitive. It made no sense. "Why?" Elian asked, the question a raw whisper in the dark. "Why would you help me?" There was a long pause. The only sound was the hum of the conduits and Elian's own ragged breathing. When Kalen finally spoke, his voice was flat, devoid of emotion, but carried a weight that filled the small space. "Because this sterile, silent world they've built is a lie, and I have a vested interest in seeing it dismantled. You, 0734, with your perfectly regulated system in catastrophic failure, are the most interesting thing I've found in this entire facility. Now, hold still." Before Elian could protest, Kalen was there, a solid presence in the dark. He didn't grab or restrain. A large, warm hand gently cupped the back of Elian's neck, the thumb pressing lightly against a nerve cluster at the base of his skull. The touch was shockingly intimate, and a wave of heat, entirely different from the fever of his micro-heat, washed through him. His body went lax, all the fight draining out of him. With his other hand, Kalen peeled back the collar of Elian's uniform and pressed a cool, thin patch against the heated skin of his shoulder blade. The effect was almost instantaneous. A cool, menthol-like sensation spread from the patch, not erasing the heat in his veins, but banking it, turning the raging fire into manageable embers. The frantic edge of his panic began to recede, the screaming in his blood quieting to a low hum. The overwhelming scent of jasmine and rain began to fade, pulled back under his skin as if by an invisible string. Elian slumped against the wall, boneless with relief and exhaustion. The world was still tilted, but it was no longer spinning out of control. He could think again, albeit slowly, his thoughts clouded with a profound sense of dislocation. He was in a dark service conduit with a strange, powerful alpha who had just saved him from decommission, using forbidden technology for reasons that were entirely opaque. The foundation of his reality had been pulverized. Kalen removed his hand from Elian's neck, and the absence of his touch was a sudden, jarring cold. He stepped back, giving Elian space. "It will take a few hours to fully stabilize," he said, his voice reverting to its usual clipped, professional tone. "When you're able, return to your duties. No one will know. Your scent is shielded. Your biometrics will read as normal." Elian slid down the wall to sit on the cold floor, his head in his hands. "I don't understand," he murmured. "I need access to the deep archives," Kalen stated, cutting through Elian's confusion with cold, hard purpose. "Specifically, the pre-concordance historical data and the early creche program records. They are sealed at a level beyond my current clearance. Your designation as a senior archive drone has latent access protocols that can be exploited. You will help me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a condition of his continued survival. Elian looked up, trying to make out the Alpha's face in the dim red light. He was being recruited, conscripted into a conspiracy he didn't understand, by a man who was the living embodiment of everything he had been taught to fear. Running was not an option. Refusal was not an option. His only path forward was into the darkness, with this dangerous, enigmatic stranger. "Why?" he asked again, his voice stronger now. "What are you looking for?" Kalen was silent for a moment. In the faint red glow, Elian could see the hard line of his jaw, the unyielding set of his mouth. "I'm looking for a ghost," he said, his voice a low, raw thing, a crack in the granite facade. "Someone the concordance erased, a name, a number, a life, and I will burn this entire facility to the ground to find it." The blocker patch was a revelation, a miracle, and a torment. On the surface, it did as Kalen promised. It shielded his scent completely and smoothed out the violent hormonal fluctuations of his failing suppressants. To any sensor or observer, he was once again O734, a model of placid stability. But beneath the surface, a profound transformation was taking place. The outer sector's technology was not a chemical sledgehammer like the concordance suppressants. It didn't erase his biology, it modulated it. It was like the difference between a soundproofed room and a set of noise-cancelling headphones. The storm was still there, but he was at its calm center, able to observe it without being consumed. For the first time in his life, Elian began to feel. Not the muted, grey-scale approximations of emotion the concordance deemed acceptable, contentment, focus, compliance, but the full, terrifying spectrum. He felt the lingering fear from his encounter with Kalen, but it was a clean, sharp thing now, not a muddy, generalized anxiety. He felt a flicker of anger at the years of his life spent in a chemical haze, and most confusingly, he felt a deep, resonant curiosity about the Alpha who had upended his world. His senses, no longer battered by biological chaos, continued to sharpen. The archives were no longer a silent, scentless void. They were a symphony of subtle sensations. He could smell the ozone from the server cores, the dry vanilla of aging paper schematics in the pre-digital vaults, the faint metallic tang of the rail guide system. He could hear the distinct hum of different energy conduits, the whisper of air through vents, the soft click of data crystals settling in their racks. The world was blooming, revealing a richness and complexity he had never imagined. His work, once a meditative, robotic rhythm, became a source of this new sensory data. He would run his gloved fingers over a crystal, feeling the microscopic imperfections on its surface, imagining the data stored within. Histories, lives, secrets. His life had been a flat, two-dimensional line. Now, it was gaining depth, texture, color, and it was terrifying. His clandestine meetings with Kalen became the focal points of his new existence. They were never planned. Kalen would simply appear, a shadow in a disused corridor, a presence in a low-traffic data node. Their conversations were brief, stripped down to the essentials. Kalen would give him a string of code, a reference number, a search parameter. Elian, in turn, would provide the results: a data fragment, a corrupted file path, a security anomaly report. He learned to use his access in ways he never had before, burrowing into the deep, forgotten layers of the archive's operating system. He moved like a ghost through the digital world, just as he had through the physical one, but now with a purpose. He was searching for Kalen's ghost. They never spoke of what had happened in the service conduit. It was an unspoken contract between them, a shared secret that bound them in a tense, fragile alliance. But the memory of it was a constant presence. The feel of Kalen's hand on his neck, the overwhelming proximity of him in the darkness, the mingling of their scents. It was a sensory brand, a moment of profound, terrifying intimacy that had redrawn the boundaries of his world. He learned more about Kalen not from his words, but from the nature of his search. The parameters he provided were specific, records from 20 to 25 years ago, focusing on the establishment of the Omega Creche system, specifically Creche 3, and the initial trials of the suppressant protocols. He was looking for intake records, medical files, transfer logs, anything related to a specific cohort of young Omegas who had been among the first to be raised entirely within the Concordance system. It was a search for a beginning, an origin point. One night, while deep in a fragmented, partially deleted medical subfolder, Elian found it, a series of records on a project codenamed Lyra. The files were heavily redacted, but the context was clear. It was an early, aggressive form of the reintegration program, designed for Omegas who showed biochemical resistance to the initial suppressant formulas. The language was cold, clinical, but the meaning was monstrous. They weren't just suppressing these children, they were altering them, rewriting their neurology to enforce compliance. They were breaking them on a fundamental level. A list of subject designations was attached. Most were just numbers, but one had been improperly redacted. A fragment of a name remained, Ian, and a designation, O113. Kalen's ghost had a number. The next time they met, in the humming silence of a server maintenance hub, Elian transferred the data fragment to Kalen's slate. He watched the Alpha's face as he read it. For a fleeting moment, the mask of cold control slipped. A spasm of profound pain crossed his features, so raw and unguarded it made Elian's breath catch in his throat. The granite cracked, revealing the fire beneath. Kalen's hand clenched around the edge of the slate, his knuckles white. "Leon," he whispered, the name a ghost on his lips. He looked up, his slate-grey eyes locking with Elian's, and for the first time, Elian saw not a director, not a soldier, but a man haunted by a loss so deep it had carved him out from the inside. "He was my brother," Kalen said, his voice rough with an emotion he didn't try to hide. The confession hung in the air between them, a fragile, impossible thing. Family was an abstract concept to Elian, a word from historical texts. He had been raised by the creche, by the system, but he understood loss. He was, in a way, a living monument to it. The loss of his senses, his emotions, his own nature. They took him when he presented, Kalen continued, his voice low, speaking more to the ghost of the past than to Elian. Our family was from a newly annexed sector. We didn't understand the Concordance's laws. They said it was for his health, for his protection. They promised he would be cared for. His gaze drifted to the humming servers, but he was seeing something else entirely. I was just a boy, an alpha, newly presented myself, full of useless strength. I couldn't stop them. I swore I would find him. I joined the Concordance military, climbed the ranks, clawed my way into a position of power, all to get back inside, to find a way to get him out. He let out a harsh, bitter laugh. It took me 20 years to get here, only to find out I was too late from the start. He wasn't just being cared for. He was an experiment. He looked back at Elian, his eyes burning with a cold, focused rage. This system doesn't care for anyone, 0734. It consumes, it erases. And Director Valerius, his name is on the authorization directive for Project Lyra. He wasn't just an administrator, he was its architect. The name landed like a stone in the pit of Elian's stomach. Director Valerius, the calm, precise beta who oversaw their lives with the dispassionate air of a botanist tending to carefully cultivated, if slightly unpleasant, plants. The man whose voice was the sound of order, of safety, of the system itself. He was the architect of this horror. The revelation solidified their alliance. It was no longer a transaction born of desperation. It was a shared cause. Kalen's quest for his brother was now intertwined with Elian's own nascent rebellion against the system that had unmade him. He began to dig deeper with a new, personal fire. He started searching for his own records, a selfish, fearful impulse he couldn't suppress. Who was he before he was 0734? He found his file buried under layers of security protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of self-discovery. It was sparse, born in the central sectors, parents designated as political dissidents, executed for fomenting biological extremism. He had been transferred to the creche at 18 months old. There was a note, appended by Valerius himself. Subject is of high-risk lineage. Recommend aggressive, early-stage suppression protocol and placement in a low-stimulus work environment. Monitor for signs of inherited instability. He was not just another Omega. He was a targeted case. His sanitized, silent life was not a generic prescription. It was a specific punishment. The chemical walls around him had been built higher, the silence made deeper, all to smother a fire they feared he had inherited. And then he found the last entry, a piece of data so small and seemingly insignificant it was almost overlooked. An annotation on his initial biological profile. Maternal scent markers show a strong affinity for Jasminum sambac, night-blooming jasmine, the scent that had bloomed from his own skin in a moment of terror. It wasn't just a random biological quirk. It was a memory, an inheritance, a ghost of a mother he had never known. He was not just an asset. He was not just an experiment. He was a son. The thought was a cataclysm. It broke something open inside him, a grief so vast and profound for a life he never had, for people he never knew, that it almost brought him to his knees. He sat there in the cold, sterile glow of his workstation, the truth of his existence laid bare, and for the first time he felt something more powerful than fear. He felt rage, a cold, quiet, deep-seated rage. And he knew, with absolute certainty, that he would help Kalen burn this place to the ground. The quiet rage simmering within Elian sharpened his focus into a razor's edge. His movements through the archives, both physical and digital, took on a new, dangerous precision. He was no longer just a ghost. He was a hunter. He and Kalen fell into a rhythm, a silent partnership that transcended words. A shared glance across a crowded hall, a data slate left on a specific shelf, a dead drop in a rarely used pneumatic tube. These became their language. The tension between them had changed. It was no longer just the friction of two opposing poles, alpha and omega, chaos and order. It was the taut, humming wire of a shared purpose, a shared threat. There was an intimacy in their conspiracy, a trust forged in the high-stakes silence. Kalen, for his part, began to see Elian not as a means to an end, a fragile tool to be exploited, but as an ally. He saw the steel that was forming beneath the Omega's quiet, trembling exterior. He saw the intelligence in Elian's eyes, the way he could see patterns in the data chaos that Kalen, with his soldier's mindset, would have missed. Elian was the key, not just because of his access, but because of his nature. He understood the system's logic from the inside, its brittle points and hidden pathways. Their search narrowed, focusing on Director Valerius. They needed proof, something concrete that would link him directly to the horrors of Project Lyra and the subsequent, more refined reintegration programs. They needed something that could not be dismissed as a historical anomaly or a regrettable necessity of the Concordance's early days. They needed a weapon. Meanwhile, Director Valerius began to watch them. His observation was not like Kalen's intense, focused scrutiny. It was a cool, dispassionate awareness, like a sensor grid sweeping for anomalies. He never confronted them directly, but his presence became more frequent in the archives. He would appear to conduct spot inspections, his calm, grey eyes sweeping over Elian's workstation, his questions about data access and file integrity becoming just a little too specific. He would engage Kalen in discussions about security protocols in the very corridors where they had previously met, his polite, even tone laced with an unspoken challenge. Valerius knew something was wrong. He might not have known the specifics, but he could sense the disruption in his perfectly ordered domain. He could sense the discordant notes in his sterile symphony. Elian and Kalen were those notes. One afternoon, the director summoned Elian to his office. The summons itself was a shock. In all his years, Elian had never been inside the administrative heart of the facility. The office was exactly as he would have imagined. Minimalist, sterile, and perfectly ordered. A large, polished desk stood in the center of the room, its surface empty save for a single data slate. Behind it, a panoramic window looked out not upon the sky, but upon the central archive core itself. A vast, cylindrical chamber filled with millions of glowing data crystals, a monument to controlled information. Valerius was standing by the window, his back to the door. "0734, he said, his voice calm and even, not turning around. "Enter." Elian stepped inside, the door hissing shut behind him. His heart was a frantic, cold drum against his ribs. The blocker patch on his back felt like a brand, a secret he was sure the director could see through his uniform. "You wished to see me, Director?" he asked, his voice a credit to his years of conditioning. Steady, respectful, devoid of emotion. "I've been reviewing your work logs," Valerius said, still gazing down at the archive core. "Your efficiency has increased by 6% over the last cycle. Commendable. However, Your data access patterns have become erratic. You have been querying files far outside your normal operational parameters, obsolete historical records, redacted medical trials. He finally turned, his pale eyes fixing on Elian. There was no accusation in his gaze, only a calm, unnerving curiosity. I wonder what an archive drone would want with such information. Elian's mind raced. A lie would be detected. Evasion would be an admission of guilt. He chose a partial truth. I was optimizing search algorithms, Director, cross-referencing obsolete file structures to identify potential data degradation in the current system. It is a self-directed, tertiary task. It was plausible. It was jargon. It was the kind of thing an overachieving, mindless drone might do. Valerius considered this for a moment, his head tilted slightly. A laudable initiative, he said smoothly. Perhaps you could demonstrate. Show me the access logs for these optimizations. It was a trap. The logs would show the specific search strings. Project Lyra, O113, his own designation. He was caught. The air grew thin. The hum of the facility seemed to roar in his ears. He was about to be exposed, his fragile rebellion collapsing before it had even truly begun. Just as he was about to stammer a response, the door to the office slid open again. Kalen stood in the doorway, his expression impassive. "Director Valerius," he said, his voice cutting through the tension. "Apologies for the interruption. There's a security alert on sub-level 9. A power conduit is fluctuating. I require O734's assistance to access the relevant schematics. His knowledge of the deep archive structure is necessary to prevent a potential data loss event." Kalen's gaze met Elian's for a fraction of a second. It was a lifeline. Valerius turned his cool gaze to Kalen. The air crackled with the unspoken power struggle between the two men, the calm, insidious control of the beta administrator versus the raw, unyielding presence of the outer sector's alpha. "Of course, Director Kalen," Valerius said, his voice betraying no hint of suspicion or annoyance. "System integrity takes precedence. O734, you are dismissed. We will continue our discussion about your initiative at a later time." The unspoken threat hung in the air. Elian gave a curt nod and practically fled the room. Kalen followed, the door hissing shut behind them, leaving Valerius alone in his sterile office, silhouetted against the glowing heart of his kingdom of secrets. Once they were in the corridor, out of sight of Valerius's office, Kalen grabbed Elian's arm, his grip hard. "He knows," Kalen said, his voice a low, urgent growl. "He's testing us, pushing the boundaries to see where they break. We're out of time." "What do we do?" Elian whispered, his body still trembling with adrenaline. "We accelerate," Kalen replied, his eyes dark with grim purpose. "There's a central server, the one Valerius's office overlooks. It's the original core of this facility. It's not just a data repository, it's a physical backup. Everything, even the files that have been digitally purged, still exists in crystalline format in that core, but it's shielded, biometrically locked. The only person with full access is the facility director." "Valerius," Elian breathed. "We need to get him to open it, and we need to find the one file that he would never risk deleting. The master file for Project Lyra, with his unredacted signature on it." "He would never access that file," Elian argued. "Not unless he had to." "Then we create a necessity," Kalen said, a dangerous light in his eyes. "We create a crisis so severe that he has no choice but to access the core to restore system stability. A crisis that implicates you." Elian stared at him, the implication dawning on him. You want me to be the crisis. Valerius is suspicious of you, Kalen explained, his voice cold and pragmatic. We use that. We'll plant a data worm in the system, key to your biometric signature. When it activates, it will look like an omega instability event, a biological imperative causing you to lash out at the system that contains you. It will start corrupting files, targeting the Kresh records first. Valerius will have no choice but to initiate a full system purge and restore from the core. When he unlocks it to initiate the restore, we'll be there. It was an insane plan, a suicide mission. To save himself, Elian would have to make himself the facility's greatest threat. He would become the monster they had always told him he was. He looked at Kalen, at the fierce determination in his eyes, the reflection of his own desperate rage. He thought of the ghost of his mother's scent, of Kalen's lost brother, of all the nameless, faceless Omegas who had been consumed by this sterile, silent machine. He had been running his whole life, from his own nature, from the truth, from the fear. Kalen's first words to him in that corridor had been, "Don't run." He finally understood. It wasn't just a command. It was an invitation to stand his ground, to fight back. He gave a single, sharp nod. "What do you need me to do?" The plan, once set in motion, moved with the terrifying, inexorable logic of a falling domino. Kalen provided the worm, a ghost of code from the outer sectors, elegant and lethal. Elian's task was to deliver it to the heart of the system, using his intimate knowledge of the archive's network architecture to bypass the preliminary security layers. He felt a strange sense of calm as he worked, his fingers flying over the console. It was the calm of a man who had already accepted the worst possible outcome. He was no longer afraid of being decommissioned. He was afraid of failing. The night they chose was during a scheduled system maintenance cycle, a time when minor anomalies would be less likely to trigger immediate facility-wide alarms. Kalen created a diversion, a series of cascading power failures in the non-essential residential sectors, drawing the majority of the technical staff and security patrols away from the archive core. It gave Elian the window he needed. He sat at a diagnostic terminal in a secluded data alcove, the lines of code scrolling before his eyes. He found the insertion point, a tiny momentary vulnerability in the system's defenses during its reboot sequence. With a final, steadying breath, he keyed in the activation command, linking the worm's payload to his own biometric signature. He pressed enter. For a moment, nothing happened. The system hummed along its prescribed path. Then, a single red error message flickered on his screen. File corruption detected, archive subdirectory 7 Omega. It had begun. He had painted a target on his own back. He sent a single encrypted pulse to Kalen's comms unit, a pre-arranged signal. The ghost is in the machine. Then he wiped the terminal and walked out of the alcove, back into the main archive hall, an ordinary Omega drone completing his shift. But he was now a time bomb, ticking down to zero. The initial corruption was slow, subtle. A few lost files, a handful of access errors. But the worm was designed to learn, to replicate, to accelerate. Within the hour, alerts began to blossom across the facility's network. The damage was spreading, and it was centered, like a spider in a web, on the Omega records. In his sterile panoramic office, Director Valerius watched the red alerts multiply on his master console. His expression remained placid, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not a random glitch. It was a targeted attack, and its logic was biological, not digital. It was lashing out at the records of its own containment. He brought up the security logs for the affected sectors, and there it was, 0734. His biometric signature was the key, the origin point of the entire cascade failure. The Omega he had suspected, the one the new Alpha security director had taken an inexplicable interest in, it was all clicking into place. The inherited instability he had warned of years ago was finally manifesting. Or, he considered with a sliver of cold calculation, it was being manipulated. Either way, the response had to be absolute. He initiated the first stage of containment, a facility-wide lockdown. Heavy blast doors slammed shut, their deep booms echoing through the corridors. The lighting shifted to a cold, clinical blue. An synthesized female voice, calm and uninflected, echoed from the speakers. Security lockdown initiated. Purity protocol engaged. All personnel remain at your designated stations. This is not a drill. Elian was in the central rotunda when the lockdown hit. He saw the blast doors descend, sealing him in the archive sector. He saw the other Omegas and Beta workers freeze, their faces masks of confusion and conditioned obedience. Purity protocol. The words sent a shard of ice through his veins. He knew what it meant from the deepest, most terrifying parts of the archives. It was the system's ultimate defense, a full-spectrum electromagnetic and chemical flush of the entire facility, designed to wipe out any rogue code, any biological contagion, any unsanctioned life. For an Omega on standard suppressants, it would be a painful, disorienting experience. For Elian, with his outer sector's blocker patch, it would be a death sentence. The flush would react with the non-standard chemicals in his system, creating a neural toxin. It would be a swift, agonizing death by 1,000 tiny short circuits in his brain. Valerius wasn't just trying to stop the worm. He was trying to eliminate its source. He was trying to kill him. Panic, cold, and absolute threatened to overwhelm him. This was it. The trap had been sprung, and he was the bait. He had to get to the core. He had to trust that Kalen would be there. He turned and ran, pushing through the frozen, compliant workers, his movements a shocking violation of the facility's placid order. He ignored their startled gasps. His focus narrowed to a single point, the massive, circular door of the central archive core at the far end of the rotunda. As he ran, the Purity protocol began. A low, vibrating hum filled the air, a sound that seemed to press in on him from all sides. The blue emergency lights began to pulse in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. A faint, acrid, chemical smell, like antiseptic and burnt wiring, began to seep from the ventilation shafts. The neutralizing agent. He had minutes, at best. He reached the core chamber just as Kalen emerged from a side corridor, his face grim, a heavy-duty plasma cutter in one hand. "He's locked us out of the primary controls," Kalen said, his voice tight. "He's running the purge from his office. The only way to stop it is a manual override from inside the core itself." He pointed to the massive, multi-layered door. "We have to get through that." Automated security drones, small, spider-like machines, descended from the ceiling, their red optical sensors locking onto the two figures in the forbidden zone. They were the system's antibodies, sent to neutralize the infection. "Buy me time," Kalen grunted, igniting the plasma cutter. A brilliant, white-hot jet of energy erupted from its nozzle with a deafening roar. He began to carve into the thick alloy of the door. The drones swarmed. Elian, unarmed and unarmored, felt a surge of pure, primal terror. He was a scholar, a librarian, not a fighter, but as the first drone scuttled toward him, its metallic legs clicking on the floor, something inside him shifted. The rage he had discovered, the grief for his lost past, the desperate need to survive, it all coalesced into a single, sharp point of defiance. He grabbed a heavy, discarded conduit pipe from a nearby maintenance cart. The drone fired a taser probe. Elian dodged, the bolt of electricity sizzling past his head and striking the wall behind him. He swung the pipe with all his strength, a wild, clumsy, desperate arc. The pipe connected with the drone's chassis with a sickening crunch of metal and plastic. The drone sparked, convulsed, and went still. Elian stared at it, his chest heaving. He had fought back. He had won. More drones were coming. He hefted the pipe, his knuckles white. He was no longer 0734. He was no longer prey. He was Elian, and he would not let this sterile tomb be the end of him. Behind him, Kalen was making progress, a glowing orange line slowly tracing a circle on the massive door. The air was growing thick with the smell of molten metal and the Purity Protocol's chemical agent. Elian's head was beginning to swim, his vision blurring at the edges. The neurotoxin was starting to work. He fought off another drone and another, his movements becoming slower, his swings less coordinated. He could feel his nervous system beginning to misfire, tiny tremors running through his limbs. He was dying. Almost there, Kalen yelled over the roar of the cutter. Just as another drone lunged, its sharp manipulator claws aimed at Elian's throat, a section of the door, glowing cherry red, gave way. Kalen kicked it in and dived through the opening. Elian, now! Elian scrambled through the hole after him, collapsing on the other side, just as the heavy inner blast door began to descend, sealing them inside the heart of the machine. They were in. They were trapped. The central archive core was a space of breathtaking and terrifying beauty. It was a cathedral of light and information. Crystalline pillars stretched from floor to ceiling, each one pulsing with a soft, internal luminescence. The air here was colder, and the hum of the facility was a deep, resonant thrum, the sound of a sleeping god's heartbeat. But the Purity Protocol was here, too. The chemical agent was thicker, the electromagnetic pulse stronger. The light from the crystals was beginning to flicker and distort. The god was having a nightmare. Elian lay on the floor, gasping, his body convulsing. The neurotoxin was flooding his system. Kalen, he choked out, his vision tunneling to a single point of light. Kalen was at his side instantly, kneeling, his face a mask of grim urgency. Stay with me, Elian. Don't you dare die on me now. He pulled a syringe from his belt, a heavy-duty military-grade nerve agent blocker. This is going to hurt, he warned, and plunged it into Elian's thigh. The pain was blinding, a white-hot agony that eclipsed the creeping numbness of the toxin. Elian screamed, a raw, ragged sound that was swallowed by the immense, humming chamber. But then, as the pain subsided, clarity returned. The tremors ceased. His vision cleared. He could breathe again. He was alive. He staggered to his feet, leaning on Kalen for support. The override, he said, his voice hoarse. It's on the central console, but it needs Valerius's biometric signature. He's not in here, Kalen stated the obvious. We can't stop it. A horrible, chilling thought began to form in Elian's mind, a thought born of his reawakened senses, his new understanding of the world. The system was a network. His worm was a network. Valerius was connected to his system on a level deeper than mere physical access. "Maybe he doesn't have to be in here," Elian whispered, his eyes scanning the pulsing, flickering crystals. "This place, it's not just storage. It's a network, a neural network, and he is its nexus." He looked at Kalen, his eyes wide with a terrifying, brilliant idea. "We can't bring him to the lock, so we have to bring the lock to him." Kalen stared at him, his mind, accustomed to tactical problems of terrain and firepower, struggling to grasp the abstract, insane logic of Elian's proposal. Bring the lock to him? What does that even mean? "His connection to this place isn't just administrative," Elian explained, his voice gaining strength, his mind working faster than it ever had before. The nerve agent blocker had not just saved him, it had supercharged his senses, stripping away the last vestiges of chemical fog. The data flowing through the crystalline pillars was no longer just light. He could almost feel it, sense its patterns, its rhythms. He built this system. He's woven into it. His biometric signature isn't just his handprint. It's a unique energy pattern, a digital ghost that haunts every circuit. The override console is just a physical terminal, a focal point, but the lock itself is everywhere. He placed his hand on the nearest crystal pillar. It was cool to the touch, and it vibrated with a life of its own. The purity protocol is designed to wipe foreign contaminants. My worm, my non-standard biochemistry. I'm the primary target. But Valerius is so deeply integrated that the system can't tell the difference between him and itself. To purge me, it has to risk purging its own architect. He looked up at the ceiling, where the main data conduits converged like the vault of a cathedral. The system is in conflict. It's trying to destroy me while preserving him. That's our opening. We have to amplify my signal, make my presence so overwhelming that the system can't isolate it anymore. We force it to make a choice. "Amplify your signal," Kalen repeated, the concept still eluding him. "How?" Elian's gaze was distant, inward. He was feeling his way through an idea that had no words. He remembered the moment in the corridor, when his scent had bloomed for the first time. It had been an act of pure, uncontrolled, biological expression. It had been a signal. "My scent," he breathed. "It's a biological signature, as unique as a fingerprint. The blocker patch is hiding it, containing it. If I take it off..." The implication was horrifying. To release his full, unshielded omega scent in the middle of a micro-heat, amplified by the nerve agent, in the very heart of a system designed to eradicate it. It would be like setting off a biological bomb. It would be an agony beyond imagining. It might kill him. It was their only chance. Kalen understood instantly. The look on his face was a mixture of horror and awe. "Elian, no. The sensory feedback in here, it could destroy your mind." "This place has been destroying my mind my entire life," Elian countered, a hard, brittle strength in his voice. "It just did it slowly, quietly. I'd rather burn out than fade away." He didn't wait for Kalen's permission. He reached behind his neck, his fingers fumbling with the edge of the patch. With a sharp hiss of pain, he tore it from his skin. The effect was immediate and cataclysmic. His scent, his true scent, exploded into the chamber. It was not the faint, fearful fragrance from the corridor. This was a tidal wave, the scent of rain on parched earth, of night-blooming jasmine, of ozone and fear and raw, defiant life. It slammed into the chamber's atmosphere, a living, breathing thing. The crystalline pillars reacted instantly. The soft, pulsing lights turned a violent, angry red. The deep hum of the core rose in pitch to a deafening shriek. The system recognized him now, not as a glitch, but as an invasion. Alarms, harsh and strident, blared from unseen speakers. Elian cried out, falling to his knees as the sensory backlash hit him. It was 1,000,000 times worse than he had imagined. The electromagnetic field of the purity protocol latched onto his exposed biochemistry, amplifying it, turning his own body into a weapon against himself. Every nerve ending was on fire. The scent in the air was so thick he could taste it, a bitter floral poison. The shrieking of the alarms felt like needles in his brain. It was too much. His consciousness was fraying, dissolving into the storm of light and sound and sensation. He was losing himself. A strong pair of hands gripped his shoulders, anchoring him. Kalen was there, his face a grim, pale mask, but his grip was steady. "Focus on me, Elian," he shouted over the din. "Focus on my voice. Don't let it take you." Elian looked up, his eyes unfocused. He could barely see Kalen through the haze of pain, but he could smell him. The scent of stone and lightning, a hard, clean, grounding presence in the floral chaos. It was an anchor. He clung to it, a drowning man clinging to a rock in a stormy sea. He focused on that scent, on the solid weight of Kalen's hands, and he pushed back against the sensory tide. He didn't just let his scent pour out of him. He directed it. He pushed it up, into the conduits, into the data streams, flooding the system with his defiant biological truth. "I am here," he screamed, without making a sound. "I am Omega. I am alive." In his office, Valerius watched his master console dissolve into chaos. The system was tearing itself apart. The schematic of the core was a flashing, screaming blot of red. The purity protocol was failing, turning on itself. He saw 0734's biosignature, no longer a single point of infection, but a raging fire consuming everything. And then he saw his own security credentials begin to flicker, his own command authority being challenged by the system itself. The machine could no longer distinguish between the Omega and the Master. It was trying to purge them both. "Impossible," he whispered, his calm finally shattering. He tried to issue a shutdown command, but the system refused. It was locked in its own death spiral. He had lost control. Inside the core, Elian felt the shift. He felt the system's frantic, contradictory logic. He could feel Valerius's digital ghost, his command signature, trying to reassert control. And he could feel the purity protocol trying to erase it along with him. He reached out with his mind, with his senses, with this new, terrifying power that was blooming in the heart of his pain. He found Valerius's signature, a cold, orderly pattern in the chaos, and he latched onto it. He wrapped his own chaotic, organic signal around it, binding them together. "If I am a poison," he thought, his consciousness a single, burning point of focus, "then you will be poisoned too." He pulled. With all the strength of his mind, his body, his very soul, he pulled that digital signature toward the central console, toward the physical lock that was demanding a sacrifice. The main override console flared to life. On its screen, 2 biometric signatures appeared, superimposed, fighting for dominance. 0734, Director Valerius. The system presented a choice. Purge contaminant, YN, but it could no longer tell which was which. Kalen saw it. He understood. "It needs a final command," he said, his voice tight with awe. "It needs a hand to press the button." Elian was still on his knees, his body shaking violently, his connection to Valerius a psychic war of attrition. He couldn't move. He could only hold on. "I can't," he gasped. "Then I will," Kalen said. He looked at the console, at the flickering signatures. He knew what he had to do. He strode to the console. He couldn't authorize the override himself, but he could confirm the system's own desperate, confused command. He placed his hand on the screen. He wasn't choosing to purge Elian or Valerius. He was choosing to purge the contaminant, and in its current state of crisis, the system interpreted that command in the only way it could. It chose to purge the primary threat to its stability. It chose to purge its own architect. Valerius's signature on the screen fractured, dissolved into static, and vanished. The system had sacrificed its master to save itself. A new prompt appeared on the screen. Purity Protocol Override Authorized. System shutdown initiated. The screaming alarms cut off, plunging the core into a sudden, shocking silence. The angry red lights faded back to a soft, neutral blue. The oppressive chemical smell began to recede as emergency vents opened, cycling in fresh, clean air. The storm was over. Elian collapsed, the psychic tension snapping. Kalen caught him before he hit the floor, cradling him gently. Elian was limp, his breathing shallow, his face pale and beaded with sweat. He was utterly spent, but he was alive. Kalen held him close, his own heart pounding with a mixture of terror, relief, and a profound, world-altering respect for the fragile, formidable Omega in his arms. He looked around the silent, calming chamber. They had done it. They had broken the machine. In his office, Director Valerius stared at his blank console. Command authority. Nullified. His connection to the system, his life's work, his kingdom had been severed. He was just a beta in a white room. He heard the hiss of his office door opening. He didn't need to turn to know who it was. Security officers, loyal to the new acting director, Kalen, stepped inside. They did not look at him with respect or fear. They looked at him as they would any other obsolete piece of equipment, ready to be decommissioned. His sterile, silent world had come to an end. The aftermath was a strange, suspended silence. With Valerius's command authority erased and the Purity Protocol aborted, the facility's automated systems defaulted to a state of inert hibernation. The lockdown remained, but the immediate threat was gone. They were trapped in the quiet, humming heart of a dead machine. Kalen carried Elian out of the central core, back into the main rotunda. Elian was conscious, but barely, his body depleted, his mind a fragile, aching void after the sensory cataclysm. He leaned heavily against Kalen, the solid warmth of the Alpha's body the only thing keeping him upright. The other workers, who had been frozen in place by the lockdown, were now stirring, their faces filled with confusion and a dawning fear. The placid order of their world had been fractured, and they didn't know what came next. Kalen ignored them. His priority was Elian. He found a secluded alcove, the same one where Elian had launched the worm, and gently lowered him to sit on a bench. He took off his own dark grey jacket and draped it over Elian's trembling shoulders. The fabric was heavy, and it smelled of kaolin, of ozone and stone, a scent that was now a comfort, an anchor. "You need a proper blocker," Kalen said, his voice low and rough with concern. He pulled a fresh patch from his belt pack. "This will help you rest. It will quiet everything down." Elian shook his head, a small, weak motion. "No," he whispered, his voice raspy. "Not yet." He didn't want the silence again, not the artificial, chemical silence of before. He needed to feel this, the clean ache of exhaustion, the sharp reality of the cool air on his skin, the lingering ghost of his own triumphant, terrifying scent. He was himself, fully, for the first time, and he was not ready to give that up. Kalen looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw not the frightened, conditioned Omega he had first met, but the person who had faced down a god machine and won. He saw the strength, the resilience, the sheer, stubborn will. He nodded slowly, respecting the choice. He sat down on the bench beside Elian, not touching, but close enough that their shoulders almost brushed. For a long time, they just sat in silence, listening to the slow, rhythmic hum of the dying facility. "What now?" Elian asked finally, his voice barely audible. "I've already transmitted the data," Kalen replied, his gaze fixed on the glowing, dormant crystals of the core. The complete, unredacted files on Project Lyra and everything that came after. My contacts in the outer sectors have it. The Meridian Concordance has a great deal of explaining to do. This facility will be re-evaluated. Its leadership, its purpose, everything is about to change. "And you?" Elian asked. "What about your brother?" A shadow passed over Kalen's face. The fire of his quest had been banked, leaving behind the cold embers of grief. "I found what was left of him," he said quietly. "A number, a story of what they did to him. It's not the justice I wanted. I wanted to bring him home. But I've exposed his executioners. His memory won't be a secret they keep anymore. It will be the weapon that brings them down. It's all I can do for him now." He turned his head, his slate-gray eyes meeting Elian's. "And what about you, Elian? The Concordance will be forced to offer reparations, new designations, relocations. You could leave this place, go anywhere." The thought was staggering. To leave the only home he had ever known. To see the sky, not through a filtered viewport, but with his own eyes. To walk in a world that had scents, sounds, textures he couldn't even imagine. It was a terrifying, beautiful prospect. Freedom. He looked out from the alcove at the other Omegas who were now huddled together in the rotunda, their faces lost and afraid. They had been sheltered and imprisoned by the same system. Their suppressants would be wearing off. Soon, they too would be facing the terrifying, painful bloom of their own senses, their own natures, without any context or guidance. They would be as lost as he had been. He thought of his parents, the political dissidents who fought for biological extremism. He finally understood what that meant. They had been fighting for the right to feel, to connect, to be whole. They had been fighting for the world he was now being offered, and he realized that his own freedom, his own escape, was not enough. "Someone has to stay," Elian said, his voice gaining a new, quiet strength. "Someone has to help them." He looked at the lost faces in the rotunda. They're going to wake up into a world they don't understand. They'll be scared. They'll think they're sick, broken. Someone has to be here to tell them they're not, to show them that they're whole. Kalen watched him, a slow, profound understanding dawning in his eyes. He had come here to burn the system down in the name of one lost Omega. But Elian, who had been a victim of that system his entire life, was choosing to stay and build something new from the ashes for all of them. It was an act of courage that dwarfed his own quest for vengeance. "You don't have to do it alone," Kalen said, his voice soft. The offer hung in the air between them, simple, solid, and real. It was not a promise of romance, not a claim of possession, but an offer of partnership, of support, of presence. A few hours later, the facility's external doors hissed open. Forces from the Central Concordance Command, alerted by Kalen's data burst, had arrived to take control. But they were not the enemy. They were investigators, reformers, sent to clean up the political and humanitarian disaster that Valerius's secret projects had become. The old order was over. The great machine was broken, and in its place, something new and uncertain would have to grow. The resolution was not a single, triumphant moment, but a slow, arduous process. The following months were a quiet chaos of deprogramming, healing, and rebuilding. The facility was transformed. The sterile white walls were painted in soft, warm colors. The scent filters were removed, allowing the faint, clean smell of the facility's hydroponic gardens to drift through the halls. The archive, once a silent tomb of controlled information, became a library, a place of learning and rediscovery. Elian was at the heart of it all. He was no longer O734. He was just Elian. He worked tirelessly, helping the other Omegas navigate the terrifying, beautiful landscape of their own reawakened senses. He taught them what he had learned in the fire, that their nature was not a sickness, that their emotions were not a weakness, that their sense were their own unique language. He was not a leader in the way an alpha was, a figure of command and authority. He was a guide, a quiet, empathetic presence who understood their fear because he had lived it. He helped them find their own names, their own histories buried in the archives, their own sense of self. Kalen stayed. He relinquished his formal title of security director, but his presence was a constant, steadying force. He handled the political maneuvering with the Concordance Command, ensuring the facility, now renamed the Lyra Sanctuary in his brother's honor, remained autonomous, a haven. He was the shield, the guardian who kept the outside world at bay, so that the fragile new world inside could heal and grow. He and Elian found their own rhythm. Their relationship was not defined by the old dynamics of Alpha and Omega. They were partners, equals, two deeply scarred individuals who had found a shared purpose in the wreckage of their lives. Their moments together were quiet, often without words. A shared meal in the newly bustling refectory, an hour spent in the archives, sifting through old records, not for secrets, but for stories. A simple, comfortable silence as they stood side by side, watching the sanctuary come to life. One evening, months after the fall of Valerius, Elian stood in the facility's new arboretum. It had been built in the massive, hollowed-out chamber of the central core, the crystalline pillars now serving as trellises for climbing vines. In the center was a small, carefully tended garden. He knelt, his bare fingers sinking into the cool, damp earth. He was tending to a small, unassuming bush with dark green leaves and delicate white flowers, night-blooming jasmine. He gently touched one of the closed blossoms, its scent still a faint, sleeping promise. He had reclaimed it. The scent of his mother, the scent of his own terror, was now the scent of hope, of new growth. He breathed in the clean, earthy air of the garden, and for the first time in his life felt a sense of profound, unshakable peace. He was not contained. He was not controlled. He was rooted. He heard footsteps on the soft earth behind him, and didn't need to turn. He knew the sound of Kalen's quiet, steady tread. The Alpha came to stand beside him, his presence a familiar comfort. He didn't speak, just stood there, sharing the quiet moment. Above them, the great domed ceiling of the core had been replaced with transparent plasteel. The stars, once a distant theoretical concept, were now a brilliant, breathtaking reality, scattered like diamond dust across a velvet canvas. Elian looked up at the infinite, open space, then at the small, determined plant in front of him. He had spent his life in a box, dreaming of the sky. Now, he was building a garden, a place to grow, to put down roots, right here in the heart of his former prison. He had found a different kind of freedom, not the freedom of escape, but the freedom to create. Kalen's hand came to rest lightly on his shoulder. It was not a claim, not a restraint. It was a simple, grounding touch, a connection. Elian leaned into it, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and together they watched the first jasmine blossom of the evening begin to unfurl, releasing its sweet, defiant perfume into the night.